Okay, Achrei Mos Kedoshim. Um, my father every year, I was- every I would say quite often, Yom Kippur, when he would talk, he would discuss, especially before the Mincha time, why is it that the Parsha of Harayos at the end of Achrei Mos is read in Yom Kippur? We understand Shacharis, we read the Avoda, the service that was done in the Beis Hamikdash in Yom Kippurim, that was very, very appropriate. But why the Parsha of Harayos, which is at the end of Achrei Mos? And at that time, my father would explain it that Gdusha is on the ladder of, in other words, Dusha represents a very high rung on the ladder of character, of perfection, of spiritual attainment. And when the Parsha of Harayos, on the other hand, Parsha of Harayos represents the lowest form. My father would call it the abyss of immorality. And my father would ask that it seems very strange that immediately after the Parsha of Harayos, the Torah should say Kedoshim to you. It would seem that the whole Torah should separate the two. All the mitzvahs of the Torah should separate the two. Dusha, that's the highest rung in the ladder of morality. And Arayas, incest, homosexuality, bestiality, all these things represent the lowest rung. Actually, is the abyss of immorality, the lowest level. And my father would say that a person, the only true protection that a person has from falling to the lowest level is by setting his goals on the highest level. Sometimes we don't attain the highest level. The highest level is something that we have to constantly work on, but we have to constantly work on it. And if we don't work on attaining the highest level, so then if we don't work on attaining the highest level, there is a fear, there is a possibility that we will fall to the lowest level. Now, I just want to add one point. There is an attitude today in education, in the chinuch, in bringing up children, that there is only one approach. We talk about children being off the derech. We don't talk about children, preventing children from getting off the derech. We only confront that issue once they're off the derech. And that's because our system of education there is one approach for everybody. Instead of realizing that each person is different, I always mention what my father said, by Yivra Elikim es Adam b'tzalmo b'tzelem Elikim bara also, that each person, it seems to be redundant, my father would say. God created man in his image. In the image of God he was created, my father would say, his image is with a small h. Each person is different. And that's the Tselem Elokim that's in him. And we have to understand, striving for the highest, but the highest for one person is not the highest for the other person. And we have to understand that each person is a different individual. Not each person should try to be a Rosh Yeshiva. Each person is different. So when we say to strive for the highest, but the highest for each person is different. And my father would always mention that the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva says that a person could be like Moshe Rabbeinu. Adon Hanaviyim. How is it possible to suggest? He says a person could be a tzaddik like Moshe Rabbeinu. And on the other hand, every person could be a Rasha like Yeravim ben Nevat. Okay, to be a Rasha like Yeravim ben Nevat, we can understand. But to suggest that each person could be a tzaddik like Moshe Rabbeinu, besides the shailis that it seems to go, it goes against, it might be going against the Ikrei HaAmunah, the foundations of the beliefs that we're required to believe. How is it shaykh to suggest such a thing? And matter of fact, I remember I once quoted that Rambam in the shul. I was giving a shir, and before I had a chance to explain it, there was a person there who was a Talmud Chacham, and he objected. He says there is no such Rambam, and he immediately added, "It's not that I know every Rambam, but the Rambam couldn't have said such a thing." And in theory, he was right. The problem was I opened up the Rambam and it was there. I showed it to him. So the pshat, I think I heard it from my father, is that just as Moshe Rabbeinu fulfilled his mission, so too we can fulfill our mission. Not that chas v'shalom that we will reach the level of Moshe Rabbeinu, though that we have that ability to reach the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. So I'm just putting that in because when we talk about striving for the highest, there is this attitude that everybody's highest when you start the child off in school, when you mechanech the child. And sometimes this attitude not only frustrates, but causes children, older yeshiva people to go off the derech. And unless we change our attitude to being concerned about preventing people from going off the derech, then we will be dealing more and more with people who are off the derech. And it's always better to prevent the problem than to deal with a problem. So my father said that a person always has to strive for the highest. And I heard the same thought from Moshe Tendler, Moshe Feinstein's son-in-law. He once spoke at actually the first dinner of our yeshiva in Chicago. He was the guest speaker. And he said, he phrased it differently than my father. He wasn't talking about these psukim. But he said there is a problem. He says today that problem is actually is not the way the problem is seen today. But in the earlier years, the American community, their attitude was, we want our children to be average Americans. I'll get into that a little bit later. We want them to be average Americans. And there was always people were on guard that the chinuch should not try to give them the impression that they should be better than average Americans. And by the way, the attitude of everybody has to be the Gadol Hador. And the attitude that everybody has to be an average American has some of the same faults. It doesn't deal with the people as individuals. There's a general approach that they try to apply to everybody. And so he said, he says, there is no such thing as the average American. He says the average American has 1.9 legs. So it was a false assumption. But in any case, a person has to strive to be the highest that he can, not necessarily to be like this one or to be like that one. And I think that, so my father would say, the only protection that we have not to fall into the abyss is to aim to be the best that we can. But if we just try to fulfill the minimum, what we consider minimum, or to be the average American, or to have the attitude, it's not so bad if I don't accomplish more, or I don't strive for more, or to have the attitude that I already reached the level that I can. The Torah tells us, "Vayelech Chanoch im Elohim." The God that Chanoch walked with God, ve'enenu ki lakachoso Elokim, and he wasn't because God took him. And Rashi says, "Tzaddik haya." Chanoch was a tzaddik, but God quickly removed him from the world because it came easy for him to sin. And my father said, what do you mean? He was a tzaddik, and it became easy for him to sin. Therefore, God removed him from the world before he actualized his sin. And my father said that Chanoch walked with God. In other words, Chanoch initially was striving to reach a higher and higher level. But at a certain point, he felt that he already reached the apex. When a person feels that they already reached the apex and there is no purpose in striving for more, so then he's bound to fall. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu removed Chanoch from the world so he shouldn't fall. And within our own mission that we were given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it has to include the idea of constantly striving for higher. His kadishtem v'yisem doshim. How does Kedusha manifest itself, my father would say? By making yourself more kadosh. Constantly striving for the highest. And this is the only protection that we have from striving for the lowest. Now, It's interesting when we discuss the what is the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tiyu, of being holy. There are three shitos that I'm aware of. There probably more shitos. What is the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tiyu? From the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, it appears that the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tiyu is a mitzvah. The mitzvah of Kedoshim Tiyu is a mitzvah of fulfilling all the mitzvahs of the Torah. Because the Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, he delineates the 613 mitzvahs d'oraisa. But at the very beginning of the Sefer HaMitzvos, where he lists the 613 mitzvos and discusses each of them in a shortened form, and he says, he lists certain rules. What is considered part of the 613 mitzvahs? The 613 mitzvahs have to be the arises. They have to be the mitzvahs that to some degree are explicit in the Torah and not learned out from the Yud Gimel Midosh HaTorah Nidreshes Behem. And among the rules he lists is any mitzvah that includes the whole Torah. Very often the Torah says, you'll do my mitzvahs. That's not a separate mitzvah. So that mitzvah is not counted as a separate mitzvah because it's just repeating what the whole Torah is. There are some that make a mistake, and some great people, that happens also, especially regarding the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Everybody is troubled. Why the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz, the Rambam doesn't count. The mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is one of the 613 mitzvahs. And some people suggest that because on the basis of a Ramban and Sifri, that they suggest that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is only fulfilled if one does all the mitzvahs of the Torah in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, there is a certain Ramban that speaks how the ultimate purpose of the mitzvahs of the Torah is to perform them in Eretz Yisrael. But so he says, since it includes the whole Torah, the mitzvah in their mind, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael includes the whole Torah. So therefore, the Rambam doesn't include it, but that does not answer the question. There are a number of other answers, but this answer is certainly wrong, because the reason the Rambam doesn't include mitzvahs hakola kol Torah kula, that include the whole Torah, because it's just repeating what's mentioned before. But there's nothing new about the mitzvah. But here, if you say the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael includes the observance of all the mitzvahs in the Torah, but nevertheless there is an added point in the mitzvah of fulfilling those mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael, so the Rambam should have included it anyway. But in any case, the Rambam rule is that a mitzvah that's kol Torah kula, that includes the whole Torah and is limited to that, is not included in the minyan of Taryag, in the 613 mitzvahs. So, and the Rambam says, and among the examples he gives is Kedoshim Tiyu. So Kedoshim Tiyu, how does one become kadosh? By observing the mitzvahs of the Torah. That's the Rambam's opinion. Rashi, however, says prushim min harayos. Rashi is concerned about why Kedoshim Tiyu is mentioned immediately after the parsha of Arayos. So he says Dusha is being prushim min harayos. In other words, you have to separate yourself from, they say, illicit relationships. I would say that perhaps Rashi is going further, from situations that tend to from situations that tend to lead to illicit relationships, for immoral relationships. However, what is very famous is the explanation of the Ramban. And the Ramban says that a person could be novel b'rishus haTorah. You could be a degenerate within the bounds, or what seems to be, within the bounds of the halacha. Let's say the Torah says halachas of kashrus. There are many things that a person is not allowed to eat. Can only eat kosher food. Only certain types of animals are kosher. You need shchita. But a person could eat glat kosher, Beis Yosef, Chassidish hashgacha, whatever that means, and still eat like a glutton. He won't be over the Easter of Nevela. But he won't be over the Easter of Trephos, assuming that the lungs are proper. But if he eats like a glutton, it won't be considered Kedoshim to you. It wouldn't be considered holy. Now we have to understand, now Dusha is something that's uniquely Jewish. My father said that it represents the highest levels in the ladder of perfection. But one thing is for sure, Dusha is something that's uniquely Jewish. My father once told me that when President Roosevelt died, and you have to realize in what period of time this happened. This was during the Holocaust, and the Jews in the United States, many of them were immigrants who ran away from Europe, and everybody was aware of what was happening in Europe, perhaps because of certain Jewish leaders who wanted to accommodate Roosevelt, and that was more important to them than their brothers who were being massacred in Europe. The Jewish people were not informed in the United States of the full extent of what was happening. But everybody knew about what was happening, and there was a certain loyalty, because we did not have the full knowledge of the extent of what was taking place in Europe. And there was a certain loyalty to the government of the United States. Now you have to be loyal to the government that you're living in, especially if they give us the ability to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But we have to be rational also. And we have to have the concern for our Jewish brothers and sisters. And if we're in a country that gives us liberty, and gives us the ability to vote, we have an extra obligation to help in protecting our brothers and sisters wherever they might be. Anyway, so when Roosevelt died, people were very concerned. They didn't know about Roosevelt not wanting to cooperate in helping saving the Jews at that time. And there were hespedim, eulogies, given all over the United States. My father mentioned to me at that time, and they felt an obligation that in Tiferet Yerushalayim, where Moshe Feinstein was the Rosh Yeshiva, they also had a hesped for Roosevelt. My father told me he went to that hesped. And he said that Moshe Feinstein gave an especially good hesped. He didn't praise Roosevelt. He just says that we have a chiyuv, we have a responsibility to give kavod lamalchus, and because malchus, as we learn in Pirkei Avos, the malchus prevents one person from swallowing up another person. And he said, especially now, when one nation is swallowing up other nations, nations are swallowing up other nations. So there is an Inyan of Kavod Malchus. Didn't speak about Roosevelt being a tzaddik, as some others did. But he said it the way it was. And then, in those days, there was a custom at the end of a hesped to make a kel molei rachman, and whoever was in charge at that time, you have to understand, every shul has its board, every school, every shul has its board of directors, and especially at that time during the World War II, there was great concern about the leaders of the United States. So they went up. Someone got up to make a kel molei rachamim for Roosevelt. And at that time, my father told me, Rav Michal Feinstein, Rav Moshe Feinstein's nephew, who later became the son-in-law of the Brisker Rav, was one of the outstanding, at that time, one of the outstanding young Talmidei Chachamim in the United States, and for that matter, in the world. So he went over to the person making the kel molei rachman, and he said to him, do not say b'ma'alos doshim b'tahorim. His focus was on the doshim. Certainly Roosevelt was certainly no tahar, but he was focusing on the doshim. He says we have chasidei u'masola, which Roosevelt was not exactly either, but he says we have chasidei u'masola. But there is no such thing as Gdoshei U'Masola, the holy ones of the nations of the world. It's important to bear that in mind when we think about the recent passing of some religious leaders. Okay, so. And we can say it about all the comments in the kel molei rachman about that. So because Kedusha is something uniquely Jewish. So now, when the Ramban says that Doshim Tiyu means that you shouldn't be a degenerate. You should act properly. You should have proper midos. So why is that identified with dusha? Why is that identified with holiness? You can see non-Jews who are concerned about their character as well. Why is it that way? And then I remember I once asked this, and more than once, I've asked this question. When we say, Daber kol das ben Yisrael molat doshim tiyu, be holy. Ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokeichem, because I am holy. And the first mitzvah that's mentioned, ish imo va'aviv tiro, yira, fear for parents. Now, kibbut moravein, we know that this is something that exists by the Umos Olam also, by the nations of the world as well. We know, the Gemara tells us that we learned their stories about how non-Jews, at the loss of great money, would not wake up their parents while they were sleeping because of the concern for their parents. Some of them farshim, even though there are probably some better answers to it. Why don't we make a bracha on kibbut aveim? I'm not sure exactly how we would fulfill when we would make that bracha. I don't know. Every time I do something, but okay, they ask, and I remember there are some that answer because it says Asher Kedoshim with mitzvos, who sanctified us with his mitzvahs, and kibbut aveim is something that exists by non-Jews as well. And we try to make brachas some and things that are uniquely Jewish. So it seems odd that the first thing that's mentioned after Kedoshim Tiyu, which speaks about being separate and not being part of the nations of the world, that the first mitzvah ish imo va'aviv tiro. It's very strange. But the answer to this question, I think, could be understood with an incident that took place when my aunt, Rabbi Soloveichik, the wife of the Rabbi, passed away, and my uncle was sitting shiva in Boston. And at that time, Rav Hutner came to Boston to Menachem Oval, my uncle, and the question arose. There was a discussion about Shiva from a hashkafa perspective, from a psychological perspective. Why is it that when it comes to a parent, to a wife, Avelus is 30 days. You have Shiva and you have Shloshim. But when it comes to a parent, the Avelus extends a whole year, Yud Beis Chodesh, 12 months. My uncle suggested at that time that cause that depends on the nature of a person's marriage, that a person will never forget his wife. It's interesting that there's a discussion in the poskim. If somebody took a hetamei rabbanim out to get married without to get married another wife for whatever the reasons are, and the hetamei rabbanim was given kahalacha, not that it was just written out. There's sometimes they're done today. So whether when the wife who didn't receive a get, whether passes away, whether you have to sit shiva for them, and the same shaila is sometimes they just separate for one reason or another. They don't want to give a get. They don't want to get, but they separate. They live apart, completely apart. So there are shilas there. There's discussion among the poskim whether there's a requirement to sit shiva. There is no requirement to sit shiva. So my a wife, certainly if it's a wife that if it's the type of marriage, if it's the proper type of marriage, a person will never forget that wife. My uncle didn't mention the shilas that I just mentioned, but he said a person, if we have the proper type of marriage, he didn't say if you have, he just assumed that people have the proper type of marriage. So they will never forget the first wife. So there wasn't the need for the Yud Beis Chodesh, but for a parent, because a parent passing away earlier, that's part of the normal. That's the normal way. That's the way things happen. So there is, in order that the person should remember his parents, and this is something, by the way, that we're a dilemma we're facing today. I remember that years ago, when I was a boy, for sure, but even when I first became a rabbi, and Yisker was being said, you would see crowds coming to the shul, people who you never saw. They would come Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, there wasn't standing room in the shul by the time of Yom Kippur. And even on the Yom Tovim, came Yisker. Everybody, people there would be big crowds, people he had never saw, not Shabbos. And even Yontif, they didn't come. They only came the last day because of Yisker. They remembered their parents today. The parent-child relationship is so weak that by Yisker, maybe one or two people who don't regularly come to shul show up for Yisker. And they're all older people. So this is especially true today, but to a certain degree was true even beforehand. People have a tendency to forget their parents as time passes by. A wife, again, if you had the proper relationship, you don't forget. So because of that, Yud Beis Chodesh, this is the answer that my uncle suggested, they instituted. However, Rav Hutner at that time said, and we could understand that the parent is the linkage that a Jew has to Matan Torah. And because of that, special emphasis is given in regard to a parent. And we could say, yes, it's true that kibbud av v'em is something that exists, or at least used to exist, by parents. In relationship between children and parents, even of non-Jews, we see that we learn certain practices that non-Jews respect, regard, that non-Jews had for their parents. It was eye-opening, even to Chazal. But the essence of kibbud av v'em, yes, they're shutfim with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it's more than just that. They represent the linkage of the Masorah, the connection to the Masorah. And because they connect, they are the linkage to the Masorah, so when we show respect to them, we are showing respect to the Masorah. We're showing respect to the Torah, to the tradition that's given over. So Kedusha emanates. The Kedusha emanates from our linkage to the Masorah. It's the Torah that gives us our Kedusha. And that, to a certain degree, could be part of the foundation of kibbud av v'em. So for the Jewish people, Kedusha goes hand in hand with kibbud av v'em, especially in view of what Chazal tell us, v'eshapsosai tishmoru. In other words, the link, the kibbud av v'em, that's the linkage to Torah. And if the parent tells us to be mechal Shabbos chas v'shalom, so we don't listen when it comes to that. So kibbud av v'em has its foundation in that. So in a sense, the Kedusha comes from the Torah. That's why Kedoshim to you, the first thing is Ish Imo V'Aviv Tiro. And I think that perhaps we can understand the Ramban along those lines also. In other words, Kedusha emanates from the Torah. It's not that Kedusha emanates from just working on our character. And I once heard, when the Muslim movement started, now the founder of the Muslim movement was Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And of course, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was one of the Golim of his generation. Reb Chaim would list 3 or 4 Golim of the previous generation. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was part of it, was one of them. But Reb Chaim himself was not identified with the Muslim movement, and probably it's well known that when Rav Itzler Petterberger, who was the Talmud or one of the Talmidim of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, came to Volozhin to try to convince the Rashi Yeshivas of Volozhin to introduce the study of Musar. Reb Chaim was opposed to it. And the question is, why was Reb Chaim opposed to it? Why was it opposed to it? I don't want to go into the whole thing. But I think what it amounts to is Reb Chaim was scared. Now, not Chas v'Shalom that Reb Yisrael Salanter had this problem, but Reb Yisrael Salanter was alive for X amount of years. And when we introduce a new approach, we always have to consider what will happen in the future with that approach. And when we consider that, we have to consider it with the trends of the time that are taking place. And Rabbi Yisrael Salanter probably felt, on the contrary, because of the Haskalah movement that was going on and everything else, on the contrary, there was a greater need at that time for the study of Musar. Reb Chaim might have felt that, on the contrary, that because of the Haskalah movement, people will see. Musar, of course, has its foundation in Torah. But people studying Musar as something, as a separate seder of Torah, could lead to seeing Musar as not part of Torah, as something different from the Torah. And I remember one of the rabbis in Chicago, when I was in high school and even post high school, he was a survivor. He was in charge of the dormitory in the yeshiva. Was Reb Meir Yugent. As a boy, he learned in Slobodki Yeshiva, and he was infused with the study of Musar. But even when he was a young boy, he suffered at the hands of the Nazis. He was in concentration camps. And he wrote books about his suffering. And he continued the study of Musar. And I would talk with him a lot. Was very interested about his experiences during the war, whatever he would reveal. And I was interested in the survivors, and the Rabbanim, the time of the war. And in discussing the Musar movement, I asked him, was there something similar, the focus on ethics among the non-Jews? And almost embarrassingly, he said to me, yes. He says, in Germany, there was a certain focus on ethics. And my uncle would mention that when he was at the University of Berlin, certain philosophers who focused on ethics and were known for their focus on ethics, as soon as the Nazis came into power, became the philosophers of the Nazi movement. So, in other words, you could see ethics and acting in a proper manner, not acting as a degenerate, if you were study ethics the way it was studied in Germany, in the courses of ethics. And you could see ethics, on the contrary, from the perspective of the Torah. In other words, what I think is, a person could fulfill all the mitzvahs of the Torah kahalacha, but not let the mitzvahs of the Torah affect his personality. And you could see the ethics as affecting his personality. But the question is, do we let the ethics affect? And then the next thing is, do we let the ethics affect our perspective of the Torah? Or is it the Torah that affects our perspective of ethics? And that is what the Ramban says. There are halachas of kashrus. There are foods that we're not allowed to eat. But if we take that a step further, not chas v'shalom, that we separate the two, then we learn restraint when it comes to eating. And the same thing is true in all the other areas of the Torah. And very often, after a Torah tells us certain halachas, the Torah tells us about dusha, holiness. Why? Because a person can fulfill all the mitzvos and he will not let it affect his personality. So Kedoshim Tiyu is Kedusha because the ethics comes from doing the mitzvos and letting the mitzvos mold our personality. That's why it's Kedoshim Tiyu. What we have, unfortunately, today there are groups beginning that they want to view ethics independent of the Torah, but they take it even a step further when their perspective to ethics, independent of the Torah, they take it and they use that to mold the halacha. Now, it's very interesting when you take a look at the Parsha of Arayos. When you take a look at the Parsha of Arayos, when the Torah introduces the Parsha of Arayos, the Torah says, Daber al bnei Yisrael, Amar Lahem, Ani Hashem Elokeichem. K'may seretz Mitzrayim hayishaftem ba, lo sasu ch'may seretz Canaan, asher ani mevi eschem hashama lo sasu, uvechukoseim lo seilechu. So how does the Torah introduce the Parsha of Arayos? The Torah introduces the Parsha of Arayos by telling us that do not try to act in the manner of the nations of the world. And specifically, they mention Eretz Canaan and Eretz Mitzrayim. And Mitzrayim, that's where the Jews were coming from. And they were going to Canaan. And there is a tendency to identify with the culture of the nations that we are associated with. And we see it in America today. And that's the idea of developing ethics independent of the Torah. And why is it when in Parsha of Arayos, the Parsha of Arayos says homosexuality, as my father said, is the abyss, the opposite of Dusha, but not just Dusha. These were things that people looked as being terrible. But if we identify ourselves with the nations that we're associated with, we have to have loyalty to the country, to the nation, especially if the nation gives us the opportunity, B'Yovdei Hashem. But the question is our Americanism part of our Judaism, or our Judaism is part of our Americanism? If our Americanism is part of our Judaism, that's the way it should be. We have to give kavod l'malchus for the opportunities that the government has given us, that the freedom in the United States has given us to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But if our Judaism is part of our Americanism, then we develop ethics independent of the Torah. And we've seen that before. But we now reached a new state where people are trying, and even those who sometimes try to identify themselves as Orthodox, they try to mold the halacha on the basis of the ethics they got from the nations of the world, from the influence of the nations of the world. Don't we see today the abominations that not just we considered abominations, but among the nations of the world, it was considered abominations. And people who did these things, they kept it a secret. But today, on the contrary, the abominations are viewed almost as mitzvos today. And the advocates are sometimes people who identify themselves as rabbis. So it's true, the Pasha Barayas is the lowest ebb of immorality, perhaps. It's the abyss, as my father would say. But even that not only can become accepted, but they can turn it into a mitzvah. So therefore, the Torah warns us. The Torah warns us, don't identify yourself as by the nations in whom you reside with. Of course, we are Americans, but our Americanism has to be part of our Judaism and not the reverse. And what happens is things that were considered terrible today are considered even a mitzvah. Why? Because in the outside world, it's considered a mitzvah. You see people, listen on TV, people identified as rabbis. And not only it manifests itself in the morality of these type of relationships, but it identifies itself in the attitude toward the Jews. Now, in the time of Roosevelt, there were many Jewish political leaders, and many people followed them, who stopped the Jewish people from taking action against the government not doing anything for the Jewish people. I remember there was a certain person who davened in our shul, and he came over in the middle of the war. And he told me he was attending a meeting. It was a secular Zionist organization. And having experienced how he got over, I don't know. But having experienced what was going on in Europe, he started screaming at the meeting. And there was a certain Reform rabbi there who was very close with President Roosevelt. And he took him aside and told him to calm down to this. Why? Because that Reform rabbi, by the way, there were some Reform rabbis that did speak up on behalf of the Jewish people. But this rabbi was probably, and this rabbi was probably one, he was held in very high esteem in all kinds of circles. There were even, that when he sometimes would attend the meeting where there were many Orthodox Jews, and he would walk in, many people would stand up for him. So he was held in very high esteem. And he took this person aside and told him to calm down. And this rabbi, he tried his best. And he even advised Roosevelt that when the Rabbanim of the Agudas Rabbanim came to Washington, D.C. to meet with Roosevelt, to speak about the situation of the Jewish people in Europe, he told Roosevelt not to meet with them. They're the weeds, he referred to them. The weeds of Europe, the weeds of Judaism. I don't remember the exact terminology. Why? Because his Judaism was part of his Americanism. And even within his Americanism, Roosevelt was number one. There was no Masorah going back to Har Sinai unless we recognize the Masorah. Then our ethics will be molded by the nations of the world. And our Judaism will be part of our Americanism. This is what Kedoshim Tiyu is. Kedoshim Tiyu is that the Torah has to, it's not just the mitzvahs of the Torah per se that we have to fulfill, but we have to let the Torah mold our personality. And the way we mold our personality is by recognizing the Masorah. Today we find rabbis who try to call themselves Orthodox, who even mention heterim for homosexuality. How are we to understand that? The Torah calls it a toeva. Toeva means it's not enough not to practice these abominations, but we have to have a certain attitude about them. But the answer is they don't believe in a Masorah. They call themselves Orthodox, but they don't believe in a Masorah. You don't believe in the Masorah? So the lowest of the low not only becomes mutter, not only becomes allowed, but it becomes a mitzvah. And people think that when they support the Arab cause in Gaza, when they support the people that raped the Jewish women on October 7th when they support the people who put Jewish children in the oven in front of their parents. They are better Americans. And they find fault only with the Jewish people. I'll say, oh, it was a terrible thing, but the Jew is not allowed to defend himself. Where does this come from? This comes, and then they'll march as Jews. They'll blow a shofar. Where does it come from? It comes from the fact that they see their Judaism, they see the Judaism as part of their Americanism rather than their Americanism as part of their Judaism. Kedoshim Tiyu tells us that our ethics has to be molded by the Torah. We have to let the Torah, we have to let the mitzvahs of the Torah mold our personalities and not chas v'shalom let the ethics of the nations mold our perception of halacha. That is the challenge we're facing today. And we have to stand firm to identify ourselves as Jews and that our Americanism is part of our Judaism and not chas v'shalom the reverse.
Thank you. If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. Does the Ramban's opinion of Kedoshim to you very similar with the Mesilas Yesharim? Obviously, the Ramban is first.
Yeah, that what?
Oh, Kedoshim to you, Prushim to you. That if you want to be Kadosh,
well, the Prushim to you is the Safra, but the question is, what does Prushim to you mean? That's the Machlokas, Rashi and the Ramban. I'm sure, hashkafa-wise, they agree with each other. But specifically, these words, Prushim Tiyu, so the Ramban understands it that it's talking in general. And Rashi seems to say that it's talking specifically about the Arayas.
no, I'm just saying, as I recall, I think the Mesilas Yesharim is similar to the Ramban.
Okay, yeah.
And then he talks about
I don't have problems with that. That's it. But the Safra says Prushim to you, but there's machlokas in understanding it. It could be both are correct in the pasuk. Sometimes we have more than one shot in the pasuk.
Someone wrote in the name of your uncle that just like an athlete wants to be in the Olympics, so they eat certain foods and they stay away from certain foods. So that's similar for us to be Kedoshim or to be Jews. So there's some things we could eat and some things we can't eat. I asked the person where Rav Yashaber said it. He quoted me to one of his books, and I couldn't find it in the whole book. And I told him, he said, I don't know.
I'm not sure what was the comment.
That Jews we have laws of what we could eat and what we can't eat, similar to like an athlete who wants to be a great athlete and get into the Olympic Games. There's some foods that they stay away from.
I say, okay, so that's similar to what I was suggesting.
It's a good idea. He said in the name of your uncle, and I asked him for the source. The source wasn't there.
Yeah. Which book did he say it was in?
I think that the prospectus of public lectures, the purplish color.
Public lectures is called.
Let me see if I could find it quickly.
Okay, don't worry about it. Anyway, so that's okay.
I don't see any other questions here.
Okay, fine.
Everyone have a good week.
You too. Okay, it should go well. Okay.